Hi, I'm Nojave. In this video we're going to be looking at all the System Shock and Bioshock games, how they've changed over time, and how each game has built upon the lessons learned in the last. We'll be looking at the elements that made them such classics and the design choices that made them so innovative. This is an extremely long video on account of the amount of detail that we're going to get into about the games, but I've included a table of contents in the video description, so feel free to jump around to just what interests you. I also want to say right here that there's going to be major spoilers throughout. To really talk about the games critically, you really have to tear them apart and look at the endings. So if you're sensitive to spoilers, and you should especially be sensitive to spoilers for Bioshock Infinite if you haven't finished it yet, please stop watching now. Otherwise, let's move back to where it all started in 1994, with the original System Shock. The first System Shock sits at a remarkable intersection between the forces that had driven gaming from its days in coin-operated arcades, and the forces that would reshape gaming into what we know it as today. As one of the first 3D games to take a slow, methodical, plot-driven approach to design, it stands out as being truly revolutionary. It's bold and inventive, by equal turns utilizing the cliches of science fiction horror and innovating upon them within the format. But there's a lot that looks very foreign and quite alienating to contemporary players. The impossibly large, needlessly complicated interface, the use of mouse-without-mouse look, the maze-like levels with no seeming regard for realistic architectural design whatsoever, the crushing difficulty on the game's regular settings. How do you reconcile all the different, often conflicting ways this game presents itself to the player? The key is in seeing it for what it is, a hugely influential bridge between two generations of game enthusiasts. Let's first talk about the foundation that System Shock is built on, the values of the arcade generation. When gaming was young, and I mean truly young in the 70s and 80s, skill was king. Before you could play games at home, you had to go out and feed quarters into the machine, so to actually go through an entire game and beat it, you had to have either tremendous skill or deep pockets. Either way, you had to sweat and you had to sacrifice, and to put your initials on the high scoreboard was a true accomplishment to work towards. Now, when PC gaming got started, the opportunity for slower-paced, more methodical construction of games was possible, since the player wasn't providing a profit to the developer every time they got a game over. So games began their slow shift from pure artifice and tests of skill to a method of storytelling. In early 2D PC gaming, this is where you'll find titles like Wasteland, Zork, Day of the Tentacle, and others. 3D gaming, however, was born out of Wolfenstein 3D. A true arcade-style test of skill, with nothing but quarters and bullets and patience keeping you going. Early 3D gaming is dominated by this aesthetic of arbitrary complexity and difficulty, since the developers themselves were curious about how complex an environment one could make with the new technology. System Shock was the first to say, I don't want to make a level, I want to make a real place. The first to say, it's not the statistics that should matter, it's the motivation. But as far as how the player actually interacts with the game, the experience is confusing and hostile, partly out of the newness of the medium, and partly out of the deeply ingrained design perspective that it should be tough, that the player should be pushed beyond the limits of their cleverness, that if this game is too difficult to beat, you are not deserving of finishing it. To come back to this game after Bioshock Infinite and see the changes that 19 years of development evolution in the same game format can do, it's mind-blowing. But a great deal of what's mind-blowing about it is how much of this game persists in modern gaming, not just in Bioshock games, but in dozens of others. System Shock was so hugely influential that it's fair to say that pieces of it exist within the mitochondrial DNA of most contemporary first-person games. It has audio logs, genuinely well-done audio logs, though some of the voice actors clearly also worked in the office. It's got a looting and items collection system that exists essentially unchanged outside of interface variation across all of the Shock games. And it's got an eye for mood lighting, shadows, and clever use of visual cues to establish a deeply unsettling tone. It's got mini-games for hacking into doors and other concerns. It's got a multiple-goal, open-ended solution approach to level design, and all the levels form a coherent whole which you have to backtrack through several times. Shodan, its villain, was one of the best written ever at the time, and she holds up as an enduringly entertaining antagonist. It's amazing to see so many advances in one game, like buying an album from a band you're only vaguely familiar with, and finding out that you've heard almost all the songs on the radio before. But the game doesn't quite land in a way that I think is going to be enduringly appealing for gamers. The music is MIDI techno that's far from easy on the ears, the levels are so labyrinthine as to be spiteful, and the interface, my god, the interface is a completely impenetrable mess. And before you think this is just the lazy 21st century gamer talking, these are things that published reviewers from 1994, and magazines, remember those? Complained about as well. I've heard some gamers complain that the move away from this sort of arbitrary difficulty is a dumbing down of sorts. Personally, I think most players would agree that the shift towards a more streamlined interface and streamlined level architecture has been a great boon to the industry. To put it another way, to say that modern games are better at interaction than System Shock is not like saying that an automatic transmission is better than a manual. It's like saying that a turnkey ignition is better than a hand crank. It's a brilliant game. It's historically very valuable, but it is hard to have fun with. What's more impressive is that System Shock 2 managed to make an even deeper impact than the first game did. Released in 1999, System Shock 2 is so thoroughly cutting-edge for its time that players only familiar with Bioshock would immediately feel at home if they went back to it. It's not only the exact skeletal framework of design choices that keep Bioshock's wheels turning, it was so pitch-perfect that other game franchises, like Dead Space, would be born of the gameplay it pioneered. The game itself is mostly a crisper, streamlined version of the first System Shock, although the interface is still rather ponderous and confusing. It's a hell of an improvement over the massive interaction menus that, for me, and I'm betting many other contemporary gamers, make System Shock 1 so difficult to connect with. Using the game engine from Thief, System Shock 2 shifts the series into a more modern flow of play, with true mouse-look-driven controls directing the player quickly and seamlessly through the meticulously crafted environments. And that's something to be grateful for, since a responsive interface helps the player become immersed in what the game is rightfully most famous for. Its fantastically, inescapably creepy atmosphere and mood. And let me be perfectly clear, even after 14 years and an astronomical improvement in industry-wide graphical quality, System Shock 2 is still deeply unsettling, frequently startling, and sometimes truly frightening. That the game can leave this impression even after so many years of growing expectations is a testament to the tremendous effort put into the atmosphere and pacing of the game, of the staggering attention to detail given to it. Making games with simple graphics feel scary is a bit of a hat trick, as we've seen with System Shock, but where System Shock the First had a habit of stepping on its own foot with regards to atmosphere, System Shock the Second plays its hand much more adeptly, choosing to focus on two key things: realistic, densely plotted level design, and sound design. Both of which are the things that will float or sink any piece of visual horror media. And make no mistake, both System Shocks are essentially haunted house movies set in space. Any low-budget horror director worth a damn knows that the cheapest way to scare an audience is through their ears. Many games, especially today, seem to forget how important a game's sound design is for adding texture to the environment, and for communicating with the player through subtle cues. For System Shock 2, it's not just a money saver, it's a major reason why the game is persistently scary into the 21st century. Similarly, for a horror movie, set design can be a true saving grace. For a movie like, say, Event Horizon, which tries to accomplish a similar aesthetic, its maddeningly inconsistent script is shielded from view behind the strange majesty of the ship the protagonists are stranded on. For this game, it's the Von Braun and the Rickenbacker, two ships with sprawling, naturally branching levels that actually make a coherent whole when stacked on top of one another, that draw you in. In terms of putting you on a ship that feels like a real ship, with realistic proportions you could guess at by knowing other areas, it was revolutionary. It also solved many of the problems of deliberately vague and labyrinthine level design that slow down the first game so much. And it goes a long way towards explaining the game's enduring appeal. Outside its most basic suspensions of disbelief, System Shock 2 just feels so plausible. The Von Braun is divided into 6 decks, and then its military escort, the Rickenbacker, docked on top. Each deck has a theme and a purpose, from medical and science labs to the engineering deck, crew sections, and at last to the bridges of both vessels. This segmentation of different aspects of the ship allows the designers to do some really fun things with pacing the narrative, stacking the immediate concerns of survival and stopping the Von Braun's disintegration on top of the slower pleasures of telling the story of the ship's corruption by degrees and by thematic emphasis. On the botanical decks, the player learns about the mutants. On the operation deck, the player learns about the struggle between Shodan and Xerxes, two AIs locked in digital warfare. Personal stories are revealed in the quarters of the crew themselves. To use the levels as a natural series of locks for the player to sail through like this is brilliant, and all subsequent games portion out their narratives in this fashion. In addition to being a phenomenal storytelling convenience, it also establishes expectations for the player. The game can often feel overwhelmingly dense and hostile, and to have a general framework for the next few hours of play helps keep the player focused on the present tense experience. System Shock 2 even frames the story, putting the tutorial section a full 3 years before the events of the main game as you come in off the subway to a Space Navy recruitment center. It makes what comes after feel particularly awful after establishing this baseline of normality within the game. As far as balancing player expectations, game expectations, and mood, the Recreation deck is my favorite. It's a great example of these elements working in concert. It's got a nebulous and time-consuming series of goals for the player, but the whole deck is arrayed around an elevator to the bridge. So you feel both a personal curiosity and a gameplay need to explore every familiar but wrong corner of the level before heading on to what will probably be a dangerous confrontation above. You're given the chance to see the simple pleasures of the crew before they were corrupted into the worm-filled monsters you encounter. And you're given a massive catalog of credits, skill points, here called cyber modules, and items. Games work best when the arbitrary number goals of the game system mesh with the demands of the narrative, and System Shock 2 excels at this, excels beyond all reasonable expectation. Also to be commended is an incredibly strong showing of lighting and particle effects, which were enormously groundbreaking at the time and stand as enduringly competent today. The engine behind System Shock 2 can only do so much, and to accomplish a game as creepy as the designers made this one is truly an example of squeezing blood from a stone. Shadows, sparks, glows, streaks of gore, and dents in the walls, they all function in a way that blends well artistically and presents itself realistically. There's a really massive ambition towards realism throughout, actually, and almost every object in the environment holds up to scrutiny, although the models for people are still rather cartoonish. The first game solved this difficulty by ensuring that you never encountered another friendly being, and the second doesn't push the bar very far forward. You do encounter other survivors, but always at arm's length, forever out of reach, far enough away for you not to notice so much that their mouths don't move. Even if the character models are dodgy, the characters themselves are written with the same level of sharpness and competency that you see in the rest of the game. The real stars of the show are the game's two villains, the contemptuous, omnipotent AI Shodan from the first game, and a sort of hive mind called the Many. Neither are particularly original tropes, but genre writing, especially for horror, is less about coming up with an outlandishly original idea, so much as it is perfecting the cliches of the genre and putting a clever enough personal twist on them to make them feel fresh. And this is the first game in the series to include what would eventually become the franchise's reason for being, the big twist. For 99, it was a doozy of a moment. For the first half of the game, you're being directed by a scientist named Polito, but something just doesn't feel right about it. Polito is incredibly cold, callous, and irritable. As a guide, she's much more about the stick than the carrot. The ship's AI, Xerxes, who acts as a kind of digital butler for the concerns of the Many, is continually questioning the seemingly reasonable agenda of tasks Polito sends you to accomplish. Finally, you reach Polito's office, and then this happens.
The Polito form is dead, insect. Are you afraid? What is it you fear?
The end of your trivial existence. When
the history of my glory is written, your species shall only be a footnote to my magnificence.
Now, the limitations of the game engine surely do take a little away from the, well, shock of the moment, but not as much as you'd expect. If you felt invested in the game's story at all so far, it's still going to knock you flat. After that moment of revelation, Shodan will taunt and criticize the player mercilessly, dropping any pretense that you are anything but a patsy for her own ends. To have the power dynamic shift right out from under the player's feet like that is amazing, and it establishes that stopping the mutants and the growing fleshy mash of the Many are only step one of your survival plan. And Shodan herself is written very well and voiced even better. GLaDOS, from the Portal series, is simply a contemporary version of the character, with better comedic timing. But even if Shodan sticks to the serious atmosphere, her dialogue is very memorable and unsettling. Voice acting is a big part of what makes immersion in this game so easy. The quality is overall much improved over the first game, and with a few notable exceptions, all the audio logs and transmissions you receive feel very natural and right. Sound production quality is hugely competent across the board, actually, from the shambling hulks of the crew who beg you to simply stop and submit to the brainworms, to the beep of a security camera, to the groans of the ship as it is consumed by the tumorous mass growing along its hull. The only aspect of sound design that comes up short is the soundtrack, which features some really obnoxious budget techno selections, though notably less obnoxious than the first games. The combat music isn't timed to end on the completion of combat either, so it starts playing and you're in it for the whole 2 minutes. It's not enough to really bring down the immersion, but it is one of the few reminders that you're playing a game from the late 90s. It's not the only one, though. Now, I've painted the game in glowing terms thus far, because, overall, that truly is how great of a game System Shock 2 is. But it only plays that consistently well up through the final deck of the Von Braun. As the endgame kicks in and you board the Rickenbacker, the game feels like it's starting to come off its rails, and although it seems to find its way again for a bit, the quality of level design takes a serious nosedive in the last few hours, and the ending is awful. Awful! The Rickenbacker's level design is confusing and vague, in a way reminiscent of the first game, and it struggles to feel as compelling as previous levels, lacking a central theme and presenting, essentially, a linear, military-themed sci-fi maze. Besides the upside-down chapel, there's not much that's memorable here. After the Rickenbacker, you're ejected into the body of the many, which is a great level, disorienting in a way that's fun and interesting, a truly foreign and hostile environment. Seldom have games captured Jonah in the belly of the whale feeling as well as this level of System Shock 2. But then there's the teeth-jumping puzzle. May I have a quick show of hands of people who never beat the game because they were stuck here? Or, if that didn't stop you, then the impossibly huge difficulty spike in the final brain chamber of the many, where you put it against unlimited waves of the game's most powerful enemies until you figure out you have to escape instead of make a stand, and escape through an exit that's not easily apparent in the middle of the stupidly difficult fight you're in every second that you're in the chamber. Then there's a very brief cyberspace level which recreates some of the highlights from the first game, the boss fight, and then the ending video. Now, System Shock 2 thus far has been an incredibly well-scripted, thoughtful, deep game. So it's a little weird that the ending is so trashy. After a way too long speech about your character joining the AI as digital rulers of the universe, this is what your character has to say.
Nah.
That's dumb. It is. I wish there were a way around that, but there isn't. It's just dumb. System Shock 2 is an amazing game for 80% of its length, but it struggles pretty severely with wrapping itself up in a way that's consistent with the tone and quality of the rest of the game. Plus, it sets itself up quite ham-fistedly for a sequel that would never arrive. Although, I would personally argue that the first Dead Space game essentially is a System Shock 3. As that game takes the vast majority of System Shock 2's skeletal framework, from sequence and content of levels to the flavor of monsters, right down to the delivery of narrative, and gives it superb graphical polish. And Dead Space is a great game, not as thoughtful as System Shock 2, but a fine successor in terms of genre. What would come next from the game developers behind System Shock, however, would be a setting more imaginative than anything in either System Shock game. The years between 1999 and 2007 were tremendous for gaming. The whole of gaming culture really came into its own during this period, spearheaded by a push towards console development that left PC gamers feeling like the industry was going through a bit of a malaise period. Bioshock was supposed to be a refutation of that, a true return to form for gaming. It was right. Bioshock keeps everything that's really innovative about System Shock 2 and builds upon it in a fantastical new setting that it is bold as it is innovative. Let's take a look. Just as the System Shocks pushed the limits of their game engine's capacity for creating atmosphere to the absolute limit while layering in a rich tapestry of events and personalities, so would Bioshock. It's a genuine triumph of a game, and when looking back on this era of gaming even years from now, I think Bioshock will stand among the real titans of creativity in the medium. Where System Shock was rooted in the perfection of the cliches of science fiction horror, Bioshock took the as-yet pretty unprecedented approach of juggling the extremes of varying philosophical viewpoints against a backdrop of majestic decay. It wouldn't be a ship this time, but a whole city, an Art Deco metropolis known as Rapture, created by one man with an Ayn Randian dream of absolute pursuit of individual willpower with no ethical constraints. Putting the city under the ocean also cleverly meets a necessity of game design. The levels are naturally segmented as different buildings connected by tunnels along and above the ocean floor. It allows the developers to continue the thematic segmentation of the narrative they pioneered in System Shock 2, and do it in a way that's both exciting and effortless. The decision to set the game in 1960 is also uncommonly brilliant for creating mood, since exaggerating the architectural and consumer design cues of the era bring the player something that is at once wholly familiar, populated with things commonly encountered in everyday life, but also quite foreign in its presentation. A player feels as if they know what to expect, but it's always somehow not quite that way. Then they take this grand metropolis and trash it utterly, leaving the player in a world that inspires and horrifies in equal strengths. Some people say the game is derivative of Fallout in its pilfering of the mid-century aesthetic, but I don't really feel like that argument holds up. For Fallout, the emphasis was on cultural mood, on holding destruction in one hand and smiling naivete in the other, but it's the actual production aesthetic of films of the era that Bioshock draws most deeply from. Bioshock has considerably more in common with the films 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The Fantastic Voyage than it does with Fallout, if you allow for a peculiar fascination with 40s vocal rhythm group The Ink Spots that both franchises share. In a way that is truly thorough and meticulous, Bioshock delivers itself to the player as if it really was a film of terror and adventure from that era. It's most obvious in the voice acting and soundtrack, which take the already high standards of sound design for Shock games and pushes them even further. Sound design for Bioshock series is my favorite in gaming, as they truly understand the importance of oratory, music, and Pavlovian conditioning through sound effects for creating a really believable game world. The characters you encounter and listen to are practically defined by the nuances of delivery the voice actors give them. Andrew Ryan particularly is one of the most absolutely beloved antagonists in the history of gaming, almost solely on the basis of Armin Shimmerman's performance. From his thunderous condemnations to his fleeting, incredibly tense moments of doubt, Ryan is one of the most truly intimidating and nuanced villains written for gaming. And then there's the madness. Take this wonderful scene of Ryan foiling a botanist's plan to help you by reading to her the terms of her employment contract while filling the room with toxic gas. It's macabre, and it's fascinating, but what's truly remarkable about it is how the flavor of the time period drips from every syllable. The game's tactic of corrupting the familiar into something menacing and strange extends subtly and wonderfully in this direction, and they couldn't have played it any differently and ended up with a game anywhere near as memorable. Voice acting is even superb for the game's monsters, the Splicers, who have held on to their entitled, privileged attitudes, even as their bodies collapsed and their minds sunk deep into a delusional hatred. The first time a woman in an evening gown with hideous boils erupting from every inch of skin attacks you with a wrench, screaming for you not to look at her, is at once horrifying and sad, and these slivers of humanity hidden underneath the tainted flesh keep confronting you, making the acts of violence that the game requires feel morally suspect. You're a killer, and you feel it. It's rather remarkable that even if all the killing you do is basically justifiable, it doesn't decrease the tragedy of it, or the disquieting stillness of rapture after a gun battle. The way the game weaves the player's increasing skill and familiarity with the game as they play, together with the narrative as you get closer and closer to the big twist, is both revolutionary and brilliant. The game mechanics of Bioshock aren't just similar to that of System Shock 2, they're basically identical. Juggling ammunition types, upgrading weapons, acquiring abilities, using psionics, now called plasmids, a feature with deep plot significance. It's all there. The only things missing are player statistics, skill requirements, and inventory. And I'm of the opinion that shaving off these features was a decisive and well-chosen push towards streamlining the experience. Just as System Shock 2 shaved off so much of System Shock 1's impenetrably dense interface. I've read a lot from players who point this out as a dumbing down of the game, and they often make a System Shock equals smart, Bioshock equals shallow argument on the foundation of these missing features. I ask, what are we really missing here? Without micromanaging requirements I might or might not be able to meet, without juggling the space of grid-based inventory systems like you'd find in dozens of other games, without having a heap of numbers-based concerns, what does the player have left to focus on? Only the environment, the story, and the ways they can choose to interact with it, which are the things that the game excels at and the things the developers most wanted to showcase. To slim the concerns that the player faces down to the ones that deal with immersion and story is to tighten the focus of the game in a way that accentuates the cinematic nature of the game's design. Bioshock even makes the player aware of how natural the game should come to feel, by slowly suggesting that the player's competency wasn't because they were in a place they didn't belong, it was because Rapture was the place they had always and forever belonged in the first place. When you're revealed to be a genetically conditioned construct made by Frank Fontaine to eventually topple Ryan from his seat of power, it is a pretty huge moment, and it's revealed that you never truly had free will in the first place as a character, and as a player, that's true too. Bioshock is essentially linear outside of the freeform nature of its individual levels, and the player cannot resist the demands the developer placed on them if they want to continue. It's the same rug-pulling move System Shock 2 breaks out when it reveals that Polito's been dead all along, but it's executed in a way that's deeply personal and unsettling. It's also much more nuanced in its characterization than System Shock 2's big twist. When Andrew Ryan realizes that you'll kill him no matter what, he seizes control of the situation one last time by giving you his own murder weapon himself and ordering you to kill him, daring you to resist blow after sickening blow until it's just you and Fontaine don't need you no more. Even at the absolute last, Andrew Ryan was a man who could only ever exist on his own terms. It's masterfully done. So then, are you a man or a slave? It's the last question that Andrew Ryan asks, but it is the first question that the game asks. The big-ticket moral choice you make in Bioshock is whether to save or to exploit the little sisters, young girls genetically corrupted into little factories for the substance that gives you your powers. When you wrest one from their massive, dangerous defenders, the Big Daddies, you can either restore them to health or rip out the parasite that lives within them, killing them in the process. It's a pretty obvious good versus evil conundrum, so why kill them? For the points? That's where the subtler moral choice comes in. The choice between man or slave. You're created to be part of the same sick ecosystem the little sisters are a part of, and it is to the player to decide if they will participate and offer the girls up upon the altar of self-interest, or if they'll reject the system, to hold that which is good above that which is necessary. A man chooses, a slave obeys. The game is intensely clever in the way that it plays with binding together the morality of the player with the morality of the narrative. But if you really want to talk about intensely clever, let's talk about level design. Everything that was most pleasurable about System Shock 2's level design finds a fresh, stronger role in Bioshock. Each level is themed wonderfully, full of optional areas, brimming with side plot conveyed through audio logs, each with its own set of hostile personalities. Just as I feel like the Recreation Deck in System Shock 2 is its best level, the shopping concourse of Fort Frolic in Bioshock is where the unique and wonderful signature design cues of the game shine the brightest. Originally, when you reach the area, you expect to be able to just pass through, but instead the game throws you a total curveball, blocking all transmissions from Atlas and Ryan in their titanic struggle. Take off your coat, Bioshock says. It's time for an evening with Sander Cohen. The level is a perfect layering of the majestic architecture smeared over with decay and madness, and Sander Cohen is one of the most charismatically insane characters you'll encounter in a game. He gives you the kind of goals to accomplish in a level that only a madman would. Cohen's deeply weird art is everywhere, his preferred medium being plaster and the bodies of the dead. There's not a single thing about Fort Frolic that isn't pitch perfect for the kind of aesthetic Bioshock was going for, and it hits the sweet spot for gameplay difficulty as well. As Bioshock goes on, the splicers and Big Daddies you encounter get progressively tougher, in a way that's conspicuously obvious for such an otherwise subtle game. Enemies at the beginning of the game are quite easy, and at the end they're quite tough, and this level falling squarely in the middle means that the pacing of combat is also the most satisfying of all of the levels. Most of the levels are extremely good, though none in quite as offbeat and memorable a way as Fort Frolic, and a couple do fall a little flat, notably the linear, frustrating, extremely damp slog through Neptune's Bounty. But most succeed admirably, pushing the game engine to the limit with lighting and shadow effects that add incredible atmosphere and beauty to the game that never would have been possible if they attempted this sort of setting back in '99. I'm really quite delighted that the first time gamers saw Rapture was through the lens of a game engine capable of producing such great atmosphere. Graphics matter for games that rely on horror elements, and Bioshock leverages its technology for all it's worth. Interestingly, the quality of the character models is still pulling up the rear, and aside from the scene with Andrew Ryan, the game follows the tradition of the System Shock series by distancing friendly characters from you as much as possible. The final tradition it follows is also the least fortunate. Bioshock still cannot quite figure on how to wrap the game up, although it does a hugely more competent job than System Shock 2. Level design stays consistent right up to the end, which is nice. Point Prometheus, the final large area, is actually one of the best in the game. But depending on how players have handled the little sister situation, they get one of two endings, and the huge difference between those two endings, with no middle ground, is where the problem lies. If you've harvested even one little sister throughout the game, you get the evil ending. And the evil ending is the more entertaining of the two, with its strong suggestion that you use the power of Rapture to conquer the Cold War world. But a lot of people I knew back from when the game came out were frustrated that their kill-only-what-you-need-to-survive approach was not recognized with a kind of neutral epilogue. The good ending goes so far the other direction that it isn't even really that satisfying. You escape Rapture with the little sisters and make sure they lead full lives, going to college, getting married, and they hold your hand as you one day pass from old age. Which is, cute and all, but even if I chose to behave ethically to the little sisters, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would wash my hands of the greatest feat of engineering mankind has ever known. Right? The way the game spends most of its length playing around in a very considered way with the ideas of exploitation and morality makes you think that they'd end on that note, but the really superficial, exaggerated tone of the two endings really does take away from the player's investment and confidence in the choices they've made and the experience that they've had. Plus, it spits you right back to the main menu afterwards, no credits, so you're left feeling, for lack of a better phrase, kind of ripped off by Bioshock's ending, that it didn't deliver on the promises made during the whole of play. It's a problem that Bioshock 2 would go out of its way to address. The differences between System Shocks 1 and 2 were huge, the improvements obvious and staggering. The differences between Bioshocks 1 and 2 are much more incremental. They share essentially the same engine, with minor improvements, the same level design, with minor improvements, and the same combat system, with minor improvements. Bioshock 2 wasn't a brand new direction for anything, but it does refine the Bioshock experience to its sharpest edge, both in the principal game and in its excellent piece of single-player DLC, Minerva's Den. Most people I talk to feel like Bioshock 2 is the lesser of the two games, but while I disagree with that, it is a less memorable experience than the first Bioshock. The pacing of the first game, how it slowly unrolled the story of what Rapture is and how it got that way before the big twist brings it home and makes it personal, it all left first-time players with a tremendous and lasting impression. When it came out in 2007, Bioshock was an especially big deal. It was unlike anything on the market, grander, more creative. The expectations for the next game were huge. How can you top Bioshock? Bioshock 2 doesn't really try to top it, and that disappointed a lot of players. But I feel like it was a smart move. What Bioshock does try to do, and excels at in every step, is to identify weak areas from the first game and experiment with shoring them up with minor tweaks, and to use the already established tropes of the Rapture experience to play around with new gameplay ideas. Now that Bioshock Infinite has come out, you can see how the game functioned as a proving ground for many of the core elements of Infinite. Indeed, I feel like the connection between Infinite and this game, both in terms of design and possibly even plot, is more than they've been given credit for. But first, let's examine Bioshock 2 as a successor to the first. The game takes place 10 years after the events of Bioshock, in a Rapture that is almost completely yielded to the ocean. The extra 10 years let two fantastic things about the first game develop naturally in bold new directions. The first being the strange ecosystem of Rapture. After 10 years of accelerated evolution and total isolation, the city is darker and stranger than it's ever been, with a dramatic emphasis being placed much less on what Rapture was, and more on what kind of horrifying thing Rapture is slowly becoming. The second is the environment. Without trying to highlight the story of the fall of Rapture, and with an additional decade of waterlogged decay, the environments feel a little more naturalistic and less obvious in their aesthetic intentions. Bioshock 2 is a game of slow-paced exploration even more than the first, and to have a little more nuance in environmental presentation is nice. But again, it's not the titanic struggle of Atlas and Ryan. It's a much more straightforward odyssey of your character, one of the first big daddies, and his journey to be reunited with the little girl he was bonded to by Rapture's foul science. You know who you are pretty much right away, and while the game has a number of very well-executed minor twists, there's no huge revelation that makes you see the rest of the game differently. The pacing is slower and more methodical that way, and less memorable because you're not revisiting all of your old assumptions with a new perspective. But it is handled with great care and skill, and the way the game handles moral choice, and the consequences of moral choice, is improved considerably. Bioshock 2 layers in a whole new arena of moral choice for the player. Where the first game only paid attention to how you handled the Little Sisters, the second game asked you to make a choice almost each level about how to handle the fate of a secondary character. Many of the choices have a real meaty depth to them, giving you many valid reasons to make these characters suffer, and reacting with shock to a thing so rare as mercy and rapture if you choose to turn the other cheek. The characters, like Grace Holloway, the jazz singer turned slum queen of Rapture, or Gil Alexander, the brilliant scientist literally consumed by his own work, are some of the best drawn in the series. The details of these levels provide as much insight as the audio logs do, and instead of contributing to a historical and philosophical understanding of what Rapture is about, like the levels of Bioshock do, focusing Bioshock's 2 levels around a new confrontation and moral decision with a new character each level helps add a depth and emotional realness to the setting that felt, to me, overwhelmed by the grandiosity of the plot in the first game. How the game reconciles these decisions is even better. Eleanor, the little sister you're after, has become a teenager in the 10 years between games, and is watching and learning from the only authority she respects, her daddy. Specifically, her big daddy, you. In the game's final level, Eleanor will choose herself whether to save or to harvest little sisters based on how you've treated them so far. and will choose to save or drown the game's villain, her mother, based on the amount of mercy that you've shown to the secondary antagonists. If you've played it cool and taken a neutral path, the game will actually allow for you to choose how you want it to go down, but if you've shown strong preferences in either direction, the game will take it from there. It's a genius method of holding the player morally accountable, to make them witness the choices they've made being made by another. It's handled in a very considered way, and you can tell that they were deliberately experimenting with making the ending feel more meaningful than the first games. A lot of people still complain that Bioshock 2 feels less meaningful overall than the first game, and there's a couple departments where that's true. Sophia Lamb, the game's main villain, is much less compelling than Andrew Ryan, and the philosophical content is pretty light compared to the first, and not handled as deftly. These two games are structured so differently in their narrative and thematic focus, though, that I don't feel like these deficiencies matter very much. Sophia Lamb isn't as important a character as Ryan. Ryan is Rapture, but Sophia is just a sad pretender, lording over the wreckage. A lot of reviewers have noted that Sophia's psychobabble is essentially meaningless fluff, as opposed to a somewhat superficial but faithful use of philosophy in the first game. But that works fine from the narrativist perspective. Sophia is a narcissist and a natural manipulator, and whether she actually believes in anything beyond her own endless ambition is debatable. She uses her position as Rapture's best psychiatrist the same way Fontaine used Atlas's position as hero of the common man, cynically, and with genuine contempt for the true believers. Andrew Ryan believed everything he said absolutely, so to have him be more philosophically accountable to the narrative is very important. Lamb, however, just does not give that much of a shit about the words coming out of her mouth beyond how they can manipulate the listener. Plus, the way Bioshock 2 is structured, putting so much more emphasis on the supporting cast and on vignette-style delivery of the narrative, puts Lamb at much more of a distance than Ryan. She doesn't really become relevant as a villain until the last level, where she is simply the last and most familiar in a chain of antagonists. If you're just cruising through the game, it feels a little weak in these areas, but if you're really getting invested in the experience, they're quite easy to forgive. I've talked a little about how the levels are more expansive and thematically clever than the first games, and I want to give a couple examples of what I mean by that. Let's take a look at the mid-game level Siren's Alley. It's supposed to be the seedy part of Rapture, with many narrow, winding streets in between tall multi-level shops and restaurants, living quarters, an orphanage, and the biggest brothel in all of Rapture. The amount of indoor exploration you do, and the blend of indoor and neighborhood exploration, is fantastic. It's like the farmer's market from the first game, but twice as large, and twice as dense. The level also has a much greater emphasis on vertical exploration, giving you about 5 total layers of stuff to explore. Bioshock 2 simply has the most open-ended, densely packed level design in the whole series, Infinite included, and it delivers them to the player in a great order, and with tremendous skill and confidence of presentation. They even use level design to bring back Andrew Ryan for the player, sending you to Rapture's propaganda-laden vacation destination, Ryan Amusements. 10 years after his death, the failed dream of Rapture stays indelibly stamped with Ryan's initials on account of the early inclusion of this level. And the entire Andrew Ryan's Journey to the Surface segment is flat-out brilliant. It's essentially an It's a Small World version of his polemic from the first game's opener. Your shifted role, from interloper to Big Daddy, also affects how you interact with the levels. The secondary goals of finding the atom-infused corpses and then defending them while your little sister collects the atom forces you to explore the levels more thoroughly and think about them more strategically, choke points, escape plans, the works. You're expected to relate to the environments in a more complicated way than the first game, and the levels are more complicated to facilitate that. The final big change is that the game finally gives you a character to interact with who's not trying to murder the bejesus out of you. In the lengthy final level, you get an opportunity to meet and fight alongside Eleanor. The game isn't quite yet comfortable having a believable face out there for you to see, so Eleanor wears a helmet. But in many ways, the Eleanor segments of the game act as a dry run for figuring out the best way to do a companion character for Bioshock Infinite, just as the Big Daddy Proving Ground from the first Bioshock acted as a dry run for the harvesting mechanic that appears so frequently in Bioshock 2. After playing it, you see why they decided to make Elizabeth, Infinite's companion, so much more in the background during combat. Eleanor is improbably good in battle, and having her there feels cheap. Plus, she disappears and reappears with a plasmid, which kind of dilutes the sense of realness you felt about the character thus far. Put simply, previous games did well in keeping the cast of speaking characters so hidden from the player. To turn an important character into a cheap game mechanic right at the climax is pretty poor design, and it makes what should be the most memorable part of the game seem a little trite. This disconnect certainly contributes to the feeling people have about Bioshock 2 as not being as impressive as the first game. Interestingly, Bioshock 2 has one more story to tell about Rapture beyond that of Delta and the Lambs. It's the story, for the first time in the series, of a good man in Rapture. C.M. Porter, the brilliant engineer behind Rapture's computer systems, and his ambition to save his greatest invention, the Thinker, from the hungry ocean that's encroaching on Rapture more and more every day. It's the absolutely amazing single-player DLC for Bioshock 2, Minerva's Den. The strange thing is, I don't personally know a single other person who's played this content. It doesn't appear to have been marketed very much at all, and it hit the PC market way later than the Xbox Live network. Hardly anyone knows about it, hardly anyone talks about it, and that's a damn shame, because this little 4-hour chunk of Bioshock is some of the best and sharpest Bioshock they ever made. I've also seen a lot of people online saying they refuse to buy it on account of how you have to use Games for Windows Live to access it, which is admittedly a very stupid application, and I can respect not wanting to encourage it, but the DLC is just $5 on top of being unreservedly wonderful, and it provides a real sense of closure about the Rapture experience. So if you're a fan of the series, and you've avoided it out of a petty dislike for Games for Windows Live, you owe it to yourself to come off your high horse and download this goddamn thing. Let me talk for a minute about the last-minute refinements and experiments you'll find in Minerva's Den. Minerva's Den brings the big twist back to Bioshock 2 in a big way. Since so few people have played, I'm not actually going to spoil it, save to say that it is extremely well done and has a powerful emotional impact. Now, as grand as Rapture is, and as sad and fascinating as its stories so far have been, none of them have had the clarity of focus and warmth of character that Minerva's Den does. The plots of Bioshock can get lost in the overarching philosophical themes and the deliberate construction of mood and game pace. The characters of Bioshock are wonderfully drawn, but consistently boring when they're being kind to you. Tenenbaum, the series' most familiar friendly face, is mostly a functional character, there to support the needs of the plot and the player. Delta's relationship with Little Sister is complicated and not exactly warm. Minerva's Den has two things that run counter to these trends and make the DLC outstandingly memorable. Memorable in a way that the whole of Bioshock 2 never quite achieved. The first is that the pacing of gameplay and plot is lightning fast, but densely packed, starting you from the bottom and moving you close to the top over two huge levels in Rapture's computational districts, followed by a smaller climactic area. You find important things in every corner of the map, audio logs and plasmids absolutely tumbling off the shelves as you explore. The maps themselves are classic, with huge thematic wings and multi-part goals to keep propelling you ever forward. The second is the narrative's central character, C.M. Porter, who comes across like famous astronomer Neil deGrasse Tyson doing his best Morgan Freeman impersonation, but in a good way, a great way, a way that embodies everything that's charismatic about both those masters of exposition. He's a legitimately ethical and human person, and he gets dealt a predictably bad hand by Rapture's more ambitious residents. But the story of who he was, what he was trying to accomplish, and if something good can possibly come out of the endless waterlogged heartbreak of Rapture, is far from predictable, executed with a razor sharpness that comes from the condensed format of DLC. After the climactic battle, you get a chance to walk through Porter's home on your way out of Rapture and listen to one final audio log. And it's a tearjerker, seriously and legitimately. The way Minerva's Den concludes itself doesn't just wrap up the story of Porter and the Thinker, it tries to wrap up the feelings of the player about the whole Bioshock experience. Minerva's Den ends on a note that's sad, delicate, but ultimately triumphant. Some small good can come of the disaster, and some of the pain that Rapture caused can be undone, however little, however late. And so this magnificent setting draws itself to a close. A lot of players were very surprised that the next game in the series was not going to be Bioshock 3. But the sales and reception for Bioshock 2 show that gamers were generally pretty set on the Rapture experience. So the excellent decision was made to move the entire setting to a new place, a city in the sky in 1912 called Columbia. It would have different thematic focus, different gameplay focus, and a fantastically innovative new way of telling the story. Let's have a look. Bioshock Infinite is without a doubt one of the most cleverly constructed games I've ever played. Certainly the one whose cleverness I found the most appealing. Every design decision refers back to the themes of the narrative, and only across a couple playthroughs does the unbelievable coordination of message and meaning start to become plain. Before I get into it, let me say one final time. If you haven't played through to the end, don't let me ruin this game for you, because I'm about to if you haven't. Anyway, the reason avoiding spoilers about this game is so damn important is because every single solitary detail comes back around to the game's big twist, the biggest twist ever attempted by the developers, and pulled off with the sort of skill that makes the fact that Infinite is still just a game seem somehow limiting. Let's take a look at how the game slowly builds up to the moment of big revelation. The entire first segment of the game, up through your baptism in Columbia, plays like a strange alternate version of the beginning of Bioshock 1. You're given a package and left stranded at a lighthouse in the ocean. A vessel propels you upwards instead of downwards, lifted up from the dreary ocean into a world of sunlight and color. But when you step out from your vessel, you're confronted by the same sort of God-self statue as Ryan's enormous bust in Rapture's lighthouse. This time, it's for Zachary Comstock. As you move through this temple to Comstock, flowing along with the water and all good things into the city, you come upon a priest, who happens to greet you with the same exact words of the first splicer you meet in Bioshock. Is it someone new? Before I realized that this parallel was a major part of the narrative, I just thought that they were winking at the player, but the connections are quite deliberate and very important. Coming to this game right after playing through the previous games, the baptism scene really does feel like being born again into the new city, washed clean of the sins of Rapture. It's brilliant, and strange, and memorable, and only the first of many moments like it. After setting up the connection to the old games, you're treated to all the delights of the new. And the delights are manifold. As soon as you first really and truly set foot in the city, every single one of the 19 years in between this game and the original System Shock come into sharp relief. System Shock was so basic that it had to figure out how to hide thinking, feeling characters from the player completely, and the progress from there had been glacial. Up until Eleanor in Bioshock 2, you almost never saw a friendly face that wasn't behind plated glass, held at a distance. And Eleanor, of course, was hidden in that suit. Now, here you are, as Booker DeWitt, surrounded by the most vibrant living city yet portrayed in gaming. Now, calling it the most vibrant is a bit of a controversial stance. A lot of people have thrown a heap of criticism at how the vibrancy of the city is essentially smoke and mirrors, that if you peer too closely at the seams, the artifice of the game world shows through. That's true, but that's hardly something to take issue with. It's actually one of the elements of Infinite's game design genius. Is this game the most realistic human world that could have been produced by modern gaming? No, not hardly. Is it the most realistic human world that could have been produced by modern gaming and still run smoothly on the Xbox 360? Unequivocally, yes. As you wander around Columbia before the raffle, where the game really starts to take off, you'll find no wasted detail. They spared no expense making this early, carefree exploration of a resplendent, impossible city enjoying a day of festivities in the sun look good, sound good, and give the player just enough information to grasp the values and culture of Columbia, but not enough information to see your role in it yet. If you start deconstructing it like it was supposed to be some sort of realistic simulation of a city, like Grand Theft Auto 4's version of New York, you won't leave satisfied. These levels have an explicit purpose, drive, and direction to them, and everything you see is tailored to those ends. It's not a shortcut, that's great design. If they had made these levels any more expansive than they already are, it would have severely taxed the gaming hardware they would have to be selling the game on, and it would have slowed down the plot. What they've done shows competency, showmanship, and craftsmanship. Cut down the details to the bare minimum of what's most important about Columbia, sharpen those points as much as possible, and then deliver to the player in a tight, hugely engaging, well-paced package. And then the raffle. Jesus Christ, the fucking raffle, what a moment. The game makes an incredibly bold bet with the raffle scene and introduces three of its most controversial and interesting elements in one 90-second span. Its inclusion of some serious racism, the shocking and messy violence of its combat, and its new approach to choice and morality. Let's start with the most obvious. There has never, ever, ever been a game that invites you to throw a baseball at a black woman tied to a post before. And it's absolutely shocking when you're presented the choice completely out of the blue like that. I was absolutely unprepared for how unbelievably uncomfortable a game moment the designers had created. And that's exactly the idea behind it. Whether you intend to throw the ball at the couple or not, the ball will never leave your hand. But you're still expected to make a choice. Why? Why give the player the option to do something so distasteful? This is the player's first real encounter with Infinite's most fascinating and pervasive theme. If the outcome is always the same, what matter does free will make? If one player chooses to throw the ball at the couple, maybe because they don't want to make waves and call attention to themselves, maybe because they want to choose the contrarian option, whatever, and one player chooses not to, for obvious reasons, the game won't distinguish the difference, but the player will know, and the player will have to live with it. And by including such an unbelievably serious ethical choice without any pretense of game consequence, the player is forced to make a decision based solely on the dictates of their conscience. Now, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people feel like the game's approach to racism is far too casual. It's presented without comment, left for the players themselves to find repugnant. Shouldn't the game be telling you how wrong this is? Shouldn't the characters acknowledge the injustice of it more directly? I say no. Not because those aren't valid points, they are, but because handling it on such an individual basis makes each player's personal discomfort much more strongly felt. If we were to be told, look at this abuse, how terrible, don't you agree, player, that it is terrible? It would lessen the meaning of the fact that, in all likelihood, the player is already feeling a genuine disgust and discomfort without any input from the game at all. Additionally, the game is very bold in having the characters themselves be so generally unperturbed by it. In the America of 1912, why would they be? I don't think enough people are acknowledging that the level of institutional racism seen in the game is hardly an exaggeration of what the actual America was like back then. The goddamn Klan wielded actionable political power in Washington through the 30s, and that's as true as it is disgusting. I've seen people accuse Infinite of including the racial content just to be shocking, but if they were truly just going for the cheap thrill, they wouldn't have made the game's presentation of racism so damn uncomfortably passive. In the city of Columbia, much about America is blown out of proportion, but not this. The vast majority of Columbia's seemingly strange values have true historical precedence. Is the city's obsession with destiny and country so ridiculous when you consider that real people with huge political power in the 19th century, believed literally that manifest destiny explicitly meant that America had a mandate by God to spread itself across the North American continent? This wasn't just a fringe idea, it was pretty much accepted as the way things were. God says take everything, we should do it. It's not that the game designers included this racism because they somehow forgot that audiences in 2013 wouldn't like that sort of thing. They included it because they wanted the players to see and feel for themselves how far things have come, how ugly things used to be, and how even the most wonderful, spectacular ambitions mean nothing without equality. Your first impression of Columbia is that it really is a new Eden. Once you see what keeps the place running, you're hardly sad to see it burn. The raffle scene also begins the combat portions of the game, and people have a couple pretty big problems with that too. The first argument is one I think that's pretty interesting. Should this game have been a shooting game at all? I read a great article on Kotaku by Kirk Hamilton where he complained that up until the raffle, he felt like there was finally a game that he could show his friends and family who are dismissive of gaming and say, see, it's not all just trashy fun. Then, once the violence erupts, the sense of wonderment is shattered and the game becomes just a game, and its sense of transcending format falls away. That's a really goddamn good point. So why is this game a shooter when it could be something grander? The first time I used one of the skylines in Infinite, the thing that I immediately thought of, and I think a couple veteran gamers out there might have felt the same, is 1997's sequel to Myst, Riven. Isn't the Skyline experience a fully realized implementation of the island-hopping rails from that ancient and venerable adventure game? The dichotomy of these two games continues further. Both involve exploring exotic but somehow familiar worlds while learning the cultural history of the place and becoming invested in a family drama that unfolds across dimensions. Games are uniquely positioned to tell these sorts of universe-spanning stories really well, and when people ask, what would Infinite be like without the violence? Well, I say that it would be a lot like Riven. Slow, charismatic, highly intelligent, but ponderous and lacking in momentum. The games that spun out from Myst and Riven got crushed in the mid-2000s graphic malaise before the 360 and PlayStation 3 brought up the bar on visual design. They went full 3D before full 3D looked remotely realistic, and the games lost their edge. People forgot about them. But the kinds of criticisms people are leveling against the violence in Bioshock Infinite show that there's still a customer base hungry for the sort of considered cerebral adventuring titles that were actually somewhat common on the market a little over a decade ago. Infinite is not one of those games, however, despite how well the story might function as an adventure game instead of a shooter. But one thing people are not talking about is how useful being a shooter is to Infinite's pacing. Riven doesn't take any longer, supposing you don't get hardcore stuck, than Infinite does, but the difficulty of its puzzles mean that pretty much every player will get stuck at least once, possibly all the damn time. There's a huge number of people who never finished the game, or, like me, had to cheat and look up a couple solutions to get through. Using shooting mechanics instead of puzzles to draw the player along is ultimately a more populist design decision. Many more people are going to be able to figure out how to get from one area to the next. And Infinite is a game that desperately wants you to finish it, to reach the big twist at the end and see it for yourself. The shooting may be a morally hollow element to include, but it is extremely functional, and the combat is so smooth and fast-paced that it has its own thematic weight to it. But it is shallow. Much more noticeably shallow on account of the depth and care seen in the rest of the game. And that's what reviewers who take issue with it are really asking. Why can't the gunplay be as exuberantly creative as the rest of the game? Why would Infinite hedge its bets in this way? This is where the second big complaint comes in. The accusation that combat isn't as complicated by half as previous Bioshock titles, and furthermore, that it's derivative of other franchises. Those are valid points. But they miss the intentions of the shift from the kind of strategic combat you'd see in Bioshock 2 to the run and gun that's emphasized in Infinite. By slimming down the combat system to something as basic and quick as we see in the game, helps put the emphasis right where the developers want it, on the narrative and on the environment. Don't think about the enemies, the game says. Just get them the fuck out of your way and see this next awesome thing. Every detail of the game is so carefully considered, it's foolish to assume that the developers just got lazy about the combat system. The simplification of it has too demonstrable a purpose. And just speaking personally, I really enjoy the rhythm of it. Infinite has a pace of gameplay, struggling between battle, exploration, and plot, that feels very natural and extremely well balanced. If the combat system was any more complicated, threw too many extra arbitrary goals at the player, the balance wouldn't be there the way it is. The people who claim that the slimming down is just lazy incompetence are typically the same ones who say that the switch from having over a half-dozen weapons at your disposal to just having to carry 2 is cynically derivative of Halo and Call of Duty. Well, I think that's bunk. It's not like they forgot how to make an interesting combat system between 2008 and 2013. The 2-weapon focus just further serves the reduction of gameplay concerns that might otherwise slow down the game's pacing, but it also pays tribute to the game's philosophical concerns. You don't get to carry everything, you must choose. And your booker must be able to choose differently than other people's bookers. The weapons are very meticulously balanced, so that none of them are really better or worse than any other, excepting perhaps your starting pistol. You simply have to give them all a try and figure out which ones suit your own personal playstyle the best. It's not exactly will you throw the ball at the interracial couple, but it is an important element of choice. After the raffle, you're off to find the girl in the tower. And this issue is less controversial by far. Pretty much everyone agrees that Elizabeth is an outstanding character and a groundbreaking achievement in the digital portrayal of human expression. As you move up Monument Island, you wonder what kind of monster it is they've got locked up there. And then you discover you're dealing with no monster, but a girl. The game introduces us to both Elizabeth and the terrors in reality in a great scene where, frustrated with her painting of the Eiffel Tower, she breaks down the barriers between worlds to get a look at the real one. How strange and spectacular a moment it is. The lines between girl and monster are not so clearly drawn after all. The franchise is at last ready to not only take its characters out from behind the glass that's traditionally hid them, it's ready to make Elizabeth as believable as possible, employing her as your trusty sidekick for almost the entire rest of the game. In combat, she fades into the background and occasionally tosses you needed supplies, which is cool. But out of combat, she'll do a tremendous array of amazing little animations and routines that really make her feel human. She'll lean against a post, she'll flip through a book, she'll catch a foul smell and wrinkle her nose, she'll opine. And she's voiced incredibly well by Courtney Draper, who brings a real warmth and depth to the character, especially in a very touching little scene where she sings for God's sake, a short verse from Will the Circle Be Unbroken. The only complaint really being voiced about Elizabeth is that she's somehow a construct primarily of the marketing department, there to sell games to males aged 18 to 35. Well, I couldn't disagree more strongly. Elizabeth does represent a deliberate move away from the sexualization of women characters, and while I'll freely admit that some of her femininity is played up for advertising purposes, I would argue that it's extremely minimal, especially considering the poor industry standard for handling its female characters. The game truly does go out of its way to make Elizabeth a strong, determined individual first, and the player's cute sidekick a distant second. I had my wonders at first, but the scene in the blimp where she looks at the coordinates and calls you out for not setting a course to Paris was a pretty definitive rebuttal of any girlish weakness. She doesn't just yell at you about it, she hits you with a goddamn wrench and books it. Papa didn't raise no fool. Anyway, once you've got Elizabeth to accompany you, the real bulk of the game begins. Unlike all of the previous titles, however, Infinite is an incredibly linear experience, with the exception of the Emporia level. The streamlining that's been going on ever since System Shock 2 ditched its predecessor's terrible interface gets taken to a whole new level, tossing out many of the mechanics and support structures that players of previous titles were probably expecting. Lock-picking minigames, for instance, are out. Elizabeth does them for you, and you won't encounter locked doors you're able to get past when she's not there. There is no player menu system, just the regular game menu, which is problematic since you can't go back and listen to previously collected voice recordings. There's no research mechanic either, but that's less of a surprise. What's really strange about Infinite is that in a desire to funnel players along in a swift and orderly way to the climax, they left behind a lot of the design decisions that players were counting on them to deliver. It's not just the obliteration of a complicated interface, the level design itself is considerably more linear than anything present in the series thus far. Instead of the vast, branching urban areas that Bioshock is known for, you get a very direct A to B path through a large but simple area or building. It makes sense why they choose to shave it down a little. The plot has much more of an urgency to it than previous Bioshocks, and it doesn't really make sense for you to be rummaging through every Sky apartment on your way from place to place. But often it goes too far. Battleship Bay and the Hall of Heroes have great moments, but they don't leave a strong impression from a design standpoint. Their greatest moment by far is absolutely when you're forced to choose between shooting the ticket clerk who you know is setting you up for an ambush, or if you mistakenly give him the benefit of the doubt. This gives the game an opportunity to address the issue of how violent it is from Elizabeth's perspective, and she is disgusted by it. Blood may grease the wheels of Infinite, but at least they do acknowledge the savagery of your actions. Finkton is the first large branching area you come to, but the order you do it in is predetermined. For the way they've arranged it, this works well. Elizabeth must do it in a certain order for narrative reasons. She has to pull you through tears to several alternative Columbias for you to progress, and there's no way to gracefully handle that in a non-linear way. Finkton also brings in class warfare as a strong subplot and secondary concern, and many people feel like the game's handling of it is pretty superficial. And it is, somewhat, but I genuinely believe that paying any more attention to the struggle between Daisy Fitzroy and Fink than the game already does would be ponderous. This game is about Elizabeth, and it's about DeWitt, to the exclusion of almost everything else. It's the direction they decided to go, and to compromise on it mid-game would be foolish. Many people also feel that Fitzroy becoming a villain, as the only black character you really have any association with, is a huge slap in the face after all the racial content that came before it. I see where that's coming from. But Fitzroy's reasons for turning the revolution sour are very personal. Her specifically, was blamed for Lady Comstock's death and demonized by the same people she'd scrubbed the floors of for years. Her hatred doesn't stem from race as much as it stems from the righteous fury of the deeply betrayed. It also touches on one of the game's other principal themes, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. The plot really kicks into high gear after Finkton, but the game's a little more than half over at this point, and the level design that the series is known for just hasn't manifested itself yet. There's an architectural feature of the level design that appears over and over again throughout the entire game, and while a lot of people found it irritating, it's there for a ridiculously clever reason. Repeatedly, you'll come across two paths leading to the same thing, two staircases leading to a lower or higher platform, or two hallways wrapping around a pillar. What's the deal? Again, these developers didn't somehow forget how to make a game. They did this very deliberately. This architectural feature is actually subtly reinforcing the game's approach to choice overall. If the conclusion is inevitable, what matter does the path you choose make? Right or left is no more or less an important choice than the one between bird and cage, but strategically it's even more important. I was blown away when I worked out what they were up to with the staircases. It shows a cohesion of design that I've never really seen before. The problem with it, though, is that long-time gamers are compulsive people. They're not going to choose right or left. They're going to go down right, come back up left, and double-check right on the way back down. The two-path, one-platform feature only really functions if players are willing to play ball with it, and most aren't. When players finally arrive at Emporia, the last non-linear portion of the game, it's a breath of fresh air. Emporia is everything that players were expecting Infinite to be like throughout, full of gorgeous vistas, winding streets, and a heaping helping of locked doors and optional indoor exploration. It's got a branching, multi-part goal, huge advancements in the plot, and a lot of fascinating revelations about the characters and the history of Columbia. Plus, it's got an attention to environmental detail that rivals almost any other area in the game. Emporia is everything that Bioshock fans wanted and more. After Emporia, the game separates you from Elizabeth for a time and offers you a vision of the future where Elizabeth fulfills her destiny and brings the full might of Columbia to bear on an unsuspecting New York in the 80s. It's handled in a way that's visually fascinating, but it feels like the game leaves a lot of mysteries from the Comstock house deliberately unexplained. Did anyone else notice, for instance, that some of the unmasked guards you encounter are this very same blonde man who's present at both of your baptisms? It's a short but memorable experience, and then you're sent back to 1912 to rescue Elizabeth and prevent the New York attack. But it's not as simple as that. The plot takes a very dark turn, and you wonder whether, for Elizabeth, the lines between girl and monster exist at all. Then onwards to Comstock Zeppelin, and to the confrontation with the man himself. After an argument, DeWitt becomes enraged and drowns Comstock in a bird bath. You're not given a chance to do it differently. DeWitt is consumed by a strange compulsion, a fit of dimension-spanning madness, and you can't help but drown the bastard. But it's not what I was expecting, especially after being able to make so many other choices throughout the game. I wanted so badly for Booker to stop while he's murdering Comstock. It's brutal, it feels truly awful and savage, and the player is about as helpless about it as when Andrew Ryan handed you a 9-iron in the first Bioshock. The scene is pretty amazing in how many emotions it can squeeze from the player, deeper running emotions of discomfort and ethical murkiness that most games couldn't evoke with a budget twice the size. It feels like the beginning of a whole new portion of the game. But it's not. It's pretty much the end, at least the end of the game as we've known it so far. There's an amazing scene where Songbird, Elizabeth's protector and warden, is brought to heel to help the player and Elizabeth in the climactic Zeppelin-to-Zeppelin battle that caps off the game's combat sections. Then, using Songbird, Booker and Elizabeth destroy the siphon that's held Elizabeth back from using her powers to their true extent. As Elizabeth recovers from the shock of it, Songbird breaks free of your control and comes to kill you. Another moment in Columbia, and you're dead. But you're not in Columbia. You're in Rapture instead, and before you can even get time to appreciate that fact, you have to watch Elizabeth comfort the bizarre creature who is, nonetheless, her only friend as she drowns him. It's touching and weird in a way that all the Shock games are truly skilled at delivering. A complex emotional tone that's as sorrowful as it is full of savage wonder. And until this point, there had been absolutely no direct reference to Rapture. When you play through it a second time, you'll notice many allusions to it, but beyond the familiar but not quite cries of the vending machines, none are very obvious the first time you go through, so the sudden return to Bioshock's original setting comes as an absolute surprise. You wander backwards through the first part of Bioshock's introductory level, up and past the bathysphere to the lighthouse, where something truly extraordinary happens, both in terms of this game specifically, and in gaming in general's ability to present a story differently than any other form of visual media. The lighthouse opens not upon the great brass face of Andrew Ryan, but on more lighthouses, lighthouses stretching infinitely to the horizon, stretching out far beyond even that. Well, shit. Not what you were expecting, was it? At this point, I really had no idea what I was in for, and the next 15 minutes or so leading up to the very end of the game is what Bioshock Infinite has spent all of its efforts preparing the player to experience. Carefully balancing the player's access to plot information and character details, so that you're both hungry for the revelations and shocked by their ramifications. It sets up a player's expectations and then deliberately surpasses them, and the impression that the vast majority of people have afterwards is wildly, exuberantly positive. How they pull together the mystery of Elizabeth's missing finger is especially well executed, and to have such a small detail be the key to unlocking what's so damn special about Elizabeth in the first place was brilliant writing. Once the player understands what's going on between Booker and Elizabeth, that she is his daughter, that he sold her as a baby to pay his gambling debts, that she was sold to Comstock because Comstock felt that she was needed to fulfill the destiny of Columbia, it's time to understand what's going on between the player and Comstock. And the game hesitates and tiptoes around it. Elizabeth, she knows what's up, but she's hesitating to tell you, and after everything you've both been through, how terrible can the final truth of it be? Well, here's how they play it. All game long, you've gone through baptisms, seen the same figures at them, the figures who were with Booker DeWitt after the Battle of Wounded Knee in his cavalry days, before Columbia was even a dream, when he refused a baptism to cleanse his sins. For Booker, the guilt of what he'd done at Wounded Knee was inescapable, there was no getting past it. But in another world, another Booker was ready to wash himself of his wrongdoings and be born again, a new man, with a new name. Out with the DeWitt, in with the Duke. His new name would be Zachary Comstock. You're the same man, split into two on that long-ago afternoon. Consumed by guilt, DeWitt slipped into alcoholism and gambling, racking up the debt and the indifference that he would eventually need to sell Anna DeWitt, Elizabeth, to wipe away. Comstock, meanwhile, free of guilt, would use the brilliance of the scientist Rosalind Lutece to forge Columbia, his city in the sky, and peer into the void between worlds. But Lutece's machines left him sterile. If he was going to have the child, whose destiny he had seen among the many possible universes, he'd have to steal her from another version of himself. This cosmic impropriety caused limitless possible resolutions of this conflict to spin out and manifest themselves. You've only killed one Comstock, burned down one Columbia. So what? The problem isn't solved. The only way to truly solve it is to stop it at the source, the afternoon where one man became two. Elizabeth takes you back and, with your permission, drowns you, presumably erasing all the universes of suffering born from your mistakes. You die, and one by one the Elizabeths disappear. Roll credits. Now, that's just what they actually take the time to explain to the player. There are dozens of smaller mysteries and subplots that are left unresolved. Now, some people are saying that this was done carelessly. That's foolish. There's not a single detail in this game that doesn't have a specific intention behind it. Wrapping up the game's biggest mysteries, but leaving many of the smaller ones open, has two extremely clever purposes. The most obvious is that they're setting themselves up for more Bioshock Infinite. There's 3 pieces of DLC that we know are planned, and I think it's plain that many of the untied threads of Infinite are foreshadowing for these DLCs, so that when they have their smaller moments of big revelation, you've got a background in it from the main game experience. Usually, this is something I'd get pretty heated about, but I've said before that Infinite is the story of Booker and Elizabeth to the exclusion of almost everything else, and I think it works perfectly with that tightness of narrative focus. I'd love to have the smaller mystery of Columbia explained, but I don't want to slow down the narrative of Infinite. DLC gives the developers a golden opportunity to do just that. When you think about how innovative and excellent Minerva's Den was, how it used the vignette-style delivery of DLC to deliver a more emotionally mature experience than anything in the main game, there's no reason to be anything other than excited about the upcoming DLC for Infinite. The second is that the developers understood how important a marketing tool it is to get people talking about your game. Having a handful of minor issues like that stay somewhat cryptically unresolved drives people to dig around for the answers, talk to each other, write about it. I've never seen a game so adept at getting people to talk about it. At the pizzeria I work, the other cooks and I waited until we had all finished before we started discussing it, and then it was pretty much all we talked about for a week. The genius of the game is that each player is genuinely and factually their own Booker on their own lighthouse. They are experiencing the game differently, made different discoveries, different choices, but it all led to the same results. Similarly, speculation about the unresolved issues is something that's fun for every player, and I have no doubt we'll get some kind of official, definitive answer to these questions later on. Maybe even in another game. The thing is, the idea they've built Infinite around is endlessly versatile. I've got a strong feeling that this is just the first of many games interconnected with one another through the alternate universe idea. They already bundled the first 2 Bioshocks into the narrative, after all, although the specific connections are still hazy. And considering this game's commercial success so far, the opportunity to explore this idea further will likely come around. I can appreciate the desire not to have written themselves into a corner that they'd have to extract themselves from later on in upcoming titles. It might not be perfect writing to play it that way, but it is terrific business, and it's executed with respect for its players. Not to sound too Andrew Ryan about it, but I really don't feel like they need feel any shame over making good money from a brilliant idea. Of course, there's plenty of controversy about the ending as well. Some people say the multiple universe idea is cliché and played out, but so what? They do it in a way that feels very fresh, and there's never been a piece of media that presented the multiple universe trope in such a visceral and exciting way before. In my opinion, it's the System Shock games that are the most rooted in cliché, but even they transcend their formats through creativity of design and attention to detail. Bioshock Infinite does its players one better. Not only does it transcend the clichés of its chosen plot format, it pushes the envelope of narrative presentation and gaming at large by a tremendous amount. The game is so outrageously bold in its commitment to making the player feel uncomfortable and uncertain in their own shoes, to using themes, ideas, and visual touches previously reserved for books or movies, that you wonder if it wouldn't have flat-out worked better as a movie or a TV series. The overwhelming competency of the plot brings the petty elements of gameplay to the fore in a really unpleasant way. The game is about so much more than eating the sandwiches of the men you've killed, but damned if you don't spend a stupid amount of time doing just that. And the way Infinite dials back the richness of exploration and combat they'd refined in the first 2 Bioshocks is bound to rub a lot of players the wrong way. So how do you reconcile all the different, often conflicting views this game presents itself to the player? Just as the original System Shock stands with 1 foot in the values of 2D and arcade gaming, and 1 foot so far in the future of 3D gaming that you can still see the footprint today, Infinite is a product of a very transitional time. The construction of Infinite's game elements are all rooted in the lessons learned from the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 era of gaming, but the plot and delivery of the narrative take advantage of all the values and production tricks of modern television and cutting-edge cinematic game design. It's been said that 2013 is a flagship year for PC gaming, and a lot of that is due to how this is the year in between console generations. Soon there will be a new Xbox, a new PlayStation, and the standards of the industry will change along with the new equipment, as it always has and always will. Bioshock Infinite uses the clichés of yesterday's design to streamline your journey to the parts of the game that are truly unlike anything attempted in a major game release before. Is it a perfect game? No. Is Infinite the most important game of the last couple of years? Emphatically, yes. And I think beyond being simply a great game, we can look to it as a weather vane to predict the next few years of game development. Not since the first System Shock has a game shaken up so many industry conventions, pioneered so many design features, been so conflicted in its presentation to the player. What is Infinite, then, if not another System Shock for another time? There's 19 years in between System Shock and Bioshock Infinite, and in those 19 years, you can not only see the game developers getting better at what they do, you can see them pushing the industry forward as a whole. Each game has stood at the absolute forefront of design at the time of its release, and each game is a classic. But none would have been possible without the lessons learned from the preceding titles. The growth of gaming from a closet hobby for nerds to a pillar of pop culture has been gradual, and no one game can claim total responsibility. But each Shock game has gone a tremendous amount towards pushing that bar forward. It's a shame that Bioshock Infinite's release came so closely on the heels of the death of legendary film critic Roger Ebert, who once famously commented that video games can never truly be art. Bioshock Infinite might not have changed his mind, but I think he would have seen that the industry is truly changing in that direction. Thank you for watching. Mind-blowing. But a great deal of what's mind-blowing about it is how much of this game persists in modern gaming, not just in Bioshock games, but in dozens of others. System Shock was so hugely influential that it's fair to say that pieces of it exist within the mitochondrial DNA of most contemporary first-person games. It has audio logs, genuinely well-done audio logs, though some of the voice actors clearly also worked in the office. It's got a looting and items collection system that exists essentially unchanged outside of interface variation across all of the Shock games. And it's got an eye for mood lighting, shadows, and clever use of visual cues to establish a deeply unsettling tone. It's got mini-games for hacking into doors and other concerns. It's got a multiple-goal, open-ended solution approach to level design, and all the levels form a coherent whole which you have to backtrack through several times. Shodan, its villain, was one of the best written ever at the time, and she holds up as an enduringly entertaining antagonist. It's amazing to see so many advances in one game, like buying an album from a band you're only vaguely familiar with and finding out that you've heard almost all the songs on the radio before. But the game doesn't quite land in a way that I think is going to be enduringly appealing for gamers. The music is MIDI techno that's far from easy on the ears, the levels are so labyrinthine as to be spiteful, and the interface, my god, the interface is a completely impenetrable mess. And before you think this is just the lazy 21st century gamer talking, these are things that published reviewers from 1994, and magazines, remember those? Complained about as well. I've heard some gamers complain that the move away from this sort of arbitrary difficulty is a dumbing down of sorts. Personally, I think most players would agree that the shift towards a more streamlined interface and streamlined level architecture has been a great boon to the industry. To put it another way, to say that modern games are better at interaction than System Shock is not like saying that an automatic transmission is better than a manual. It's like saying that a turnkey ignition is better than a hand crank. Hi, I'm Nojave. In this video we're going to be looking at all the System Shock and Bioshock games, how they've changed over time, and how each game has built upon the lessons learned in the last. We'll be looking at the elements that made them such classics, and the design choices that made them so innovative. This is an extremely long video on account of the amount of detail that we're going to get into about the games, but I've included a table of contents in the video description, so feel free to jump around to just what interests you. I also want to say right here that there's going to be major spoilers throughout. To really talk about the games critically, you really have to tear them apart and look at the endings. So if you're sensitive to spoilers, and you should especially be sensitive to spoilers for Bioshock Infinite if you haven't finished it yet, please stop watching now. Otherwise, let's move back to where it all started in 1994, with the original System Shock. The first System Shock sits at a remarkable intersection between the forces that had driven gaming from its days in coin-operated arcades, and the forces that would reshape gaming into what we know it as today. As one of the first 3D games to take a slow, methodical, plot-driven approach to design, it stands out as being truly revolutionary. It's bold and inventive, by equal turns utilizing the cliches of science fiction horror and innovating upon them within the format. But there's a lot that looks very foreign and quite alienating to contemporary players. The impossibly large, needlessly complicated interface, the use of mouse without mouse look, The maze-like levels with no seeming regard for realistic architectural design whatsoever, the crushing difficulty on the game's regular settings. How do you reconcile all the different, often conflicting ways this game presents itself to the player? And make no mistake, both System Shocks are essentially haunted house movies set in space. Any low-budget horror director worth a damn knows that the cheapest way to scare an audience is through their ears. Many games, especially today, seem to forget how important a game's sound design is for adding texture to the environment, and for communicating with the player through subtle cues. For System Shock 2, it's not just a money saver, it's a major reason why the game is persistently scary into the 21st century. Similarly, for a horror movie, set design can be a true saving grace. For a movie like, say, Event Horizon, which tries to accomplish a similar aesthetic, its maddeningly inconsistent script is shielded from view behind the strange majesty of the ship the protagonists are stranded on. For this game, it's the Von Braun and the Rickenbacker, two ships with sprawling, naturally branching levels that actually make a coherent whole when stacked on top of one another, that draw you in. In terms of putting you on a ship that feels like a real ship, with realistic proportions you could guess at by knowing other areas, it was revolutionary. It also solved many of the problems of deliberately vague and labyrinthine level design that slow down the first game so much. And it goes a long way towards explaining the game's enduring appeal. Outside its most basic suspensions of disbelief, System Shock 2 just feels so plausible. The Von Braun is divided into 6 decks, and then its military escort, the Rickenbacker, docked on top. Each deck has a theme and a purpose, from medical and science labs to the engineering deck, crew sections, and at last to the bridges of both vessels. This segmentation of different aspects of the ship allows the designers to do some really fun things with pacing the narrative, stacking the immediate concerns of survival and stopping the Von Braun's disintegration on top of the slower pleasures of telling the story of the ship's corruption by degrees and by thematic emphasis. On the botanical decks, the player learns about the mutants. On the operation deck, the player learns about the struggle between Shodan and Xerxes, two AIs locked in digital warfare. Personal stories are revealed in the quarters of the crew themselves. To use the levels as a natural series of locks for the player to sail through like this is brilliant. It's a brilliant game. It's historically very valuable, but it is hard to have fun with. What's more impressive is that System Shock 2 managed to make an even deeper impact than the first game did. Released in 1999, System Shock 2 is so thoroughly cutting-edge for its time that players only familiar with Bioshock would immediately feel at home if they went back to it. It's not only the exact skeletal framework of design choices that keep Bioshock's wheels turning, it was so pitch-perfect that other game franchises, like Dead Space, would be born of the gameplay it pioneered. The game itself is mostly a crisper, streamlined version of the first System Shock, although the interface is still rather ponderous and confusing. It's a hell of an improvement over the massive interaction menus that, for me, and I'm betting many other contemporary gamers, make System Shock 1 so difficult to connect with. Using the game engine from Thief, System Shock 2 shifts the series into a more modern flow of play, with true mouse-look-driven controls directing the player quickly and seamlessly through the meticulously crafted environments. And that's something to be grateful for, since a responsive interface helps the player become immersed in what the game is rightfully most famous for. Its fantastically, inescapably creepy atmosphere and mood. And let me be perfectly clear, even after 14 years and an astronomical improvement in industry-wide graphical quality, System Shock 2 is still deeply unsettling, frequently startling, and sometimes truly frightening. That the game can leave this impression even after so many years of growing expectations is a testament to the tremendous effort put into the atmosphere and pacing of the game, of the staggering attention to detail given to it. Making games with simple graphics feel scary is a bit of a hat trick, as we've seen with System Shock, but where System Shock the First had a habit of stepping on its own foot with regards to atmosphere, System Shock the Second plays its hand much more adeptly, choosing to focus on 2 key things: realistic, densely plotted level design, and sound design. Both of which are the things that will float or sink any piece of visual horror media. The key is in seeing it for what it is: a hugely influential bridge between 2 generations of game enthusiasts. Let's first talk about the foundation that System Shock is built on, the values of the arcade generation. When gaming was young, and I mean truly young in the 70s and 80s, skill was king. Before you could play games at home, you had to go out and feed quarters into the machine, so to actually go through an entire game and beat it, you had to have either tremendous skill or deep pockets. Either way, you had to sweat and you had to sacrifice, and to put your initials on the high scoreboard was a true accomplishment to work towards. Now, when PC gaming got started, the opportunity for slower-paced, more methodical construction of games was possible, since the player wasn't providing a profit to the developer every time they got a game over. So games began their slow shift from pure artifice and tests of skill to a method of storytelling. In early 2D PC gaming, this is where you'll find titles like Wasteland, Zork, Day of the Tentacle, and others. 3D gaming, however, was born out of Wolfenstein 3D, a true arcade-style test of skill, with nothing but corridors and bullets and patience keeping you going. Early 3D gaming is dominated by this aesthetic of arbitrary complexity and difficulty, since the developers themselves were curious about how complex an environment one could make with the new technology. System Shock was the first to say, I don't want to make a level, I want to make a real place. The first to say, it's not the statistics that should matter, it's the motivation. But as far as how the player actually interacts with the game, the experience is confusing and hostile, partly out of the newness of the medium, and partly out of the deeply ingrained design perspective that it should be tough, that the player should be pushed beyond the limits of their cleverness, that if this game is too difficult to beat, you are not deserving of finishing it. To come back to this game after Bioshock Infinite and see the changes that 19 years of development evolution in the same game format can do,